Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of our Food for Thought seminar series today as we celebrate 25 years of the Food Standards Agency. My name is Rachel Pointer, and I'm part of the Food for Thought team here at the FSA. Before I introduce you to today's speaker, I'd just like to remind you of some housekeeping information. So as this is a Microsoft Webinars event, you won't be able to unmute yourself or come onto the camera, and the chat function is disabled, but we do, however, welcome any questions or comments that you may have, which can be posted in the Q&A box on the screen. Any questions which are submitted will be picked up at the end of the presentation, but feel free to add your questions as we go along, and we'll come to them later on. So today's seminar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our Food for Thought YouTube channel and circulated after the event. And we're always looking for recommendations for speakers to invite to future Food for Thought seminars. So if you've any suggestions, then please let us know at our email address, which is foodforthought@food.gov.uk. For today's seminar, I'd like to provide a very warm welcome to our speaker, Professor Robin May, Chief Scientific Advisor for the Food Standards Agency. And also joining us today is Dr. Adam Cook, Head of Science and Research at the FSA, who will be chairing the Q&A. As the FSA's Chief Scientific Advisor, Professor May provides expert scientific advice to the UK government. He is responsible for the integrity of the science and evidence that underpins FSA's activities, as well as for communicating the FSA's evidence-based approach to other government departments, external stakeholders, and consumers. The 1st of April 2025 marked 25 years since the FSA was first established, and over a quarter of a century that FSA has existed, science has changed enormously and at pace. So in today's seminar, we'll be taking a look back at some of the major scientific developments of the last 25 years and the changes and opportunities that may be ahead. So from all of us at the Food for Thought team, we hope you enjoy the seminar, and without further ado, I'll hand over to our wonderful speaker to discuss the science of food safety 25 years in the past, 25 years into the future.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rachel. I hope, well, first, the most important question, can you hear me?
Yes.
Robert. Yeah. Excellent. Good. That's a good start for 10. And oh, I've got lots of hands up here. I hope the hands up means yes, you can hear me rather than no, you can't. Good. So let me share my screen, which is the next major challenge we're going to have. And then assuming all works smoothly, 1 second. There we go. Right. Hopefully. Let's move that here. There we go. Okay. Can you see and hear that okay?
Yes, we can, Robin.
Brilliant. Okay, in that case, I'm released. If I suddenly disappear, you can blame Clive House Wi-Fi. I'm in the office today, or you can just quietly go and make yourself a cup of coffee instead. Thanks so much for joining, everybody. It's really nice to be here, and it's really good to be able to celebrate 25 years. Quite exciting. I remember being 25. It was a good age. I'm slightly older than that now, but it's really nice to be reflecting on a quarter of a century of FSA. So what I thought I'd do today is think a little bit about where we've come over the last 25 years, and do a little bit of frankly wild speculation about where we might go in the next 25 years, with the caveat that I am no more qualified than anybody else to speculate on what the next 25 years may bring, but it's fun to do it. And then afterwards, I hope we'll have lots of time for questions and answers on anything you like, really, but I'm particularly interested to hear from you about your ideas for the future and things that you think might be happening. But everything goes, and Adam will be a brilliant master of ceremonies for that, I'm sure. So without further ado, you do have to work a little bit in my seminar, I'm afraid, although I can't actually mark your homework, so no one will know if you're doing it or not. But I have a few questions for you, and I'm going to start straight away with a nice straightforward one, which is 25 years ago was the year 2000, for those of us old enough to remember it. And what kind of major world events from the year 2000 have stuck with you? Have a ponder. For those of us old enough, we might remember kind of millennium parties and all that kind of exciting stuff that happened. But actually, I was thinking about this. What kind of leaps out at me from the year 2000 are a couple of things, actually. So one is this. Remember this logo? Those of you old enough, this is the Millennium Bug. For those of you who were not old enough to know about this, pre the year 2000, there was a kind of genuine sense of panic around the world about the fact that computers had up until that point used a date system, which was day, month, and then 2 digits for a year. So, for example, 1 stroke 2 stroke 75. And suddenly people realized that when we flipped over the year 2000, the 2 digits wouldn't work anymore because the computer would think it was 1900 rather than 2000. And there were predictions of doom and disaster. In fact, we even appointed, I believe, a cabinet minister to oversee the Millennium Bug in this part of the world. And there was a huge project in Whitehall to try and avoid the consequences of the Millennium Bug. And it ended up, possibly because of that work, or possibly it was never a problem in the first place, that it caused almost no issues at all. But on the New Year's Eve on 1999, I remember quite clearly everyone was sort of waiting to see if planes would fall out of the sky or banks wouldn't work the next day, and actually everything was fine. The other thing that I really remember from that period is some mobile phones, not because mobile phones were launched, obviously, but this was apparently, I checked it out, I didn't know this, this was the first year in the UK when more than half the population owned a mobile phone. Clearly, I was a serious retrograde because I didn't own a mobile phone for several years after this, but half the population did. But it was definitely a moment I can remember where you went from sort of stopping in the street and going, oh, look, someone's got a mobile phone, to realizing they were relatively common. And I remember years later having the same experience with Bluetooth headsets, when you realize that people who were apparently talking to themselves were suddenly talking to a headset. And so it was quite an interesting technology adoption moment in 2000. But actually, for me, the thing that really sticks in my mind and has been quite influential ever since was this event, which was the announcement of the draft Human Genome Project. For those of you who can think about that far, so this was the project, obviously, to sequence the human genome. And it's quite hard to remember the scale of that undertaking at that stage, but it had taken literally years and years and years, and was a very interesting collaboration stroke competition between a private company owned by Craig Ventnor on the left-hand side of the screen, and the public effort led by the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins on the right hand. And it had been an enormous undertaking over many, many years, and cost, we estimate, about $3 billion in total to finish. And was announced in the White House by President Bill Clinton, as was then. There were simultaneous announcements over here, Tony Blair, etc. And it was a really, really big moment for science, not least because it was the first moment in my life where sort of a science story was absolutely bang on kind of headline stuff. So that was a really exciting moment, and actually slightly disappointing. I don't think we've really had sort of a good news story in science of that scale since then. Although I guess I would argue that something like the COVID vaccine was sort of good news story, clearly wrapped up inside a very bad news story. So that was back in the year 2000. Feels a long time ago, doesn't it? Those were some really big stories at the time, but I think because given that we're all interested in food, I thought a much more foodie themed question might be this one. Think back and ponder, maybe you can even put it in the Q&A, think back, what popular food products were new and exciting, do you think, when the FSA was launched? And there are obviously loads and loads and loads, but I had a quick trawl at things launched around that period of time, and here are two that really jumped out at me. Stuffed crust pizza. It had actually been launched slightly before this, a couple of years before this, but apparently 2000 was the first year when it sort of made it into the mainstream in terms of retail. So pre-2000, you couldn't buy a stuffed crust pizza. And I have to say, I do quite like a stuffed crust pizza, even though I kind of slightly worry about all the badness within it. And the other one was Cadbury's Heroes, which were the sort of mainstay of children's parties for about 10 years, I think. They were launched in 2002. I'm sure there are plenty of others, and maybe you can, in the Q&A later, you can let me know what your launched food of 2000 was that's really influenced your life. Okay, so slightly more seriously, let's think a bit about what's happened over the last quarter of a century. And obviously, there has been a huge amount of stuff that's happened over the last 25 years. And some of it has been really, really very sad, very disappointing, and very problematic. First and foremost, obviously on the screen in front of you, BSE, that's more than 25 years old, clearly. That is the reason, essentially, the FSA exists. So this enormous epidemic, essentially, of bovine spongiform encephalopathies in cattle in the UK, and then being transmitted to humans who'd eaten that meat. And essentially was the turning point in food safety when people realised that an independent food regulator was well overdue to stop a crisis like that ever happening again. So that is essentially one of the main reasons for our existence. Since then, though, we have had some other food crises, happily none quite as dramatic as that, but some pretty major ones. So you might remember the E. coli on sprouting seeds outbreak back in, excuse me, coughing and spluttering, back many years ago, and that one was actually very limited in the UK, but a big spread across most of Europe, and really shocking numbers, thousands of people affected, over 50 deaths, and has really been very transformative in thinking about kind of the genomics that we can use today to trace foodborne pathogens. And some other ones that make it into the media quite a lot. Horse meat, of course, obviously not a food safety threat, but definitely a food authenticity threat when people suddenly realised their beef lasagna was not entirely beef lasagna. And one of the things that's been hugely influential in thinking about NFCU and our work around food authenticity generally. Fipronil in eggs, another one that rings some bells, I'm sure. This idea that this banned chemical was present in eggs, particularly in continental Europe. Lots of concern about egg safety all around the world, and actually stimulated a lot of interest in things like high resolution mass spectrometry to try and detect chemicals like this in all sorts of food products, and of course products that might use those foods. And those are 4 sort of slightly randomly picked events over the last 25 years. I'm sure many of you will have interesting other examples to throw into the mix. It's not all miserable. Hopefully there have been some highs over the last 25 years too. And I think it's really important to kind of sometimes look back and think about what those highs are, and some of the major contributions that we have made. And in some cases, individual people on this call will have made those cases. In my case, I can't take responsibility for any of this because I'm a relatively late joiner, but I am delighted that it's happened. So obviously back in the day when FSA had the remit for nutrition across the whole of the UK rather than just in Northern Ireland as we do now, we were really instrumental in creating the system that has led to traffic light labelling of nutrition on food. And these labels like the one in front of you now are really familiar fodder to us. I have to say, I think this is a massively good news story in terms of health. Clearly, there is a slightly bad news story, in fact, in that every time we pick up one of those delicious looking things, go, oh no, it's all red. We have only ourselves to blame. But on balance, that's probably a good thing. The food hygiene rating scheme is still one of the top ways that people recognise the FSA and its role in society. And I have to say, something that I use on a very regular basis. I'm sure, like most of you, if you're in a new city and thinking about where to go for dinner, you spot a restaurant, and I sneakily Google this on my phone to check what its food hygiene rating is if it's not displayed before I go in, and go elsewhere if it's a bit dubious. Happily, not often you find a dubious one these days, which is great. And more recently, of course, we've had some really major impacts in specialist areas, and particularly around allergies. So a lot of the work on allergies and Natasha's law in particular, which is really transformative for people with food allergies. And right at the moment, one that has occupied many of us, particularly in CERD and in policy, is around the implementation of the Precision Breeding Act that will change the way we regulate genome-edited crops and potentially down the line livestock. So I think some really big wins for kind of science within policy across the piece, and things that actually shape people's lives every day. It's really, I suspect almost everyone, if I was to walk out into the street there, almost everyone in the street would have been involved with one of these 4 things in the last 24 hours. So it's a really nice impact. So all those kind of developments over the last quarter century are underpinned by lots of work across the piece, but particularly a lot of science. And I think, especially if you're in science, it's quite hard sometimes to reflect on the fact that it has changed enormously. You sort of, it happens quite incrementally, and you kind of forget about it. It's like when you're climbing a mountain, you forget to look back and go, crikey, I've come a long way up. You just think, oh gosh, it's a bit of a slog. So I thought it'd be useful just to have a little think back to 25 years ago in terms of science. This is obviously not 25 years ago, it's a bit longer. It's actually not as old as you think. I think it's photos from 1980, which is depressingly recent in my mind. But actually, I think it still holds true. Around the year 2000, which was the time when I was finishing my PhD, for example, the lab I did my PhD in did not look that dissimilar to this. I'm happy to say there was a little bit more kind of personal safety equipment, and even happier to say that it was not entirely populated, apparently, by white middle-aged men. Or there is, I think there is that is possibly a lady in the back, but it's even so not a very diverse scientific workforce, and it was a lot more diverse by 2000. But nonetheless, science in 2000 was largely, I would say, a wet lab driven process. People sat in the lab and they did experiments on test tubes and petri dishes and whatever. And actually, those of you who have done some microbiology of that era will probably remember that most microbiology in those days involved a combination of looking at stuff and some other slightly less sensible processes. So quite often you'd be given a plate like this as a microbiologist, and your identification would rely on you going, that sort of greeny bluey blob in the middle, that's probably a penicillium because it's a bit fluffy and it's greeny and bluey. And the yellow ones, well, that might be a Staph aureus or whatever. And it was pretty kind of ad hoc, really. And then you might do some more lab tests then. They'd usually be slow. They would require growing it for a few days and maybe some chemical color changes and these kind of things. And one of the things I particularly remember when I was training in microbiology was the all-important sniff test, which is quite hard to measure. But we were told, when you grow a plate like this, open your plate and have a good sniff. And depending on whether you smell bananas or the one I remember most, I can't remember what it was for now, but potent body odor, that was one that was described, you could identify the bacteria that was growing on that plate. The risk in sticking your head inside an agar plate and sniffing it is not trivial. So I'm quite glad we've moved away from those days. But it is quite important, I think, to remember that back when FSA was founded, investigating a microbiological foodborne disease outbreak would involve quite a lot of people doing things like this, which is quite astonishing, really. Happily, we've moved on a bit since then. So nowadays, if you have a microbiological outbreak, you're very, very likely to use some of these things. You're probably likely to sequence it, maybe even whole genome sequence thing. And sequencers, DNA sequencers, another thing that have radically changed over time. Back in 2000, when the human genome was announced, as I said earlier, a single sequencing machine would occupy the best part of an office like the one I was at in here. And that would still only give you a tiny bit of DNA sequencing. In order to do the whole human genome, the centers involved had hundreds of those sequencing machines running in parallel. Now you can buy a machine like this that sits inside fits well and truly within a desk or even smaller, and will sequence you a whole genome to really high coverage quite fast. And of course, just a few years ago, even more amazingly, this little device, the Nanopore, was launched, which is just slightly bigger than an old-fashioned USB memory stick, if you can remember those. Plugs into a computer, into a laptop even, and will sequence you a genome very, very swiftly, and has been really, really transformative in terms of, particularly for things like bacterial genomes. It's not just about genomics. We've also had major instrumentation like this. This is called a MALDI. This is a system that uses essentially kind of analysis of chemicals on the surface of bacteria to identify them very, very swiftly, and can do it at very, very high complexity. So you can do lots and lots of strains at once. And it's a real mainstay of sort of NHS diagnosis. And actually, I think one of the things that we don't shout about enough is there have been some really big developments in really simple tech. So, for example, lateral flow devices that are now enormously familiar to all of us from COVID time, or dipstick technologies. So now, I don't know if anyone's had this recently, but if you go to your GP and say, oh, I think I might have a bladder infection, for example, they may well say, go and wee in this bottle here, come back, and in 10 minutes time I'll give you an answer, because we have dipstick technology to identify E. coli, for example. And these really simple point of care tests, I think, are incredibly important for tackling all sorts of infection problems, but particularly in the future foodborne infections. And the other big transformation in the last 25 years, of course, has been the data revolution. Back in 2000, quite hard to imagine, but it was true. Email was still pretty new. We could email sort of some stuff, text files and things, but you certainly couldn't email, big data files or videos or anything like that. The internet was incredibly rudimentary. There was very little stuff. There was certainly no kind of online server databases or archives, let alone things like QR codes or mobile authentication or anything like that. Now we live in a world that is incredibly data rich. And if you want to, you can, for example, identify your bacteria. You can immediately check where that bacterial type has been found elsewhere in the world. You might be able to identify the individual people if you have that kind of level of access. You can look at travel plans, movement of food, livestock movements, all these sort of things without ever leaving your desk. And that data integration, I think, has been incredibly important and will continue to be incredibly important going forwards. So that is going back 25 years. And now the most fun part, at least for me, is what about going forward 25 years? And this is particularly beneficial, I have to say, because I was carefully working it out. And 25 years from now, I am pretty convinced I will be retired. So I can say pretty much anything I like. And in 25 years' time, most of you will find it hard to track me down and tell me I was wrong. So with that, it means I can go completely nuts, can't I? And speculate on whatever I like. So what kind of things do I think might happen over the next 25 years? And as I say, I'm very happy to be totally shouted down about this and hear all sorts of other ideas. And I think one of the things to think about whenever you're thinking the future is how risky that is. And so my final question for you this lunchtime is, who is this person? Bonus marks if you know it. And what did he say that is relevant at this point of the talk? I'm going to give you a second to pause. And then I'm going to tell you. So this is, for those who don't know, this is Niels Bohr, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and is one of the people widely credited with the idea of kind of quantum mechanics and quantum physics, and ideas that he had back in the 1920s. And in fact, that's another big anniversary this year. People talking about quantum uncertainty as a concept coming of age in 1925. So it's 100 years old this year. So I thought it'd be quite nice to combine those birthdays together. And why is Niels Bohr, quantum physicist, appearing in an FSA talk? Well, he's appearing because he has one of my favorite quotes of all time, which is this one: "Prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future," which I really like, and probably overuse quite a lot of the time, particularly when my kids are saying, "What are we doing this weekend?" And I can tell them this. So with that caveat from Niels Bohr in mind, let me do some wild prediction and think about what might be happening in the next 25 years. Well, I think one thing that we're in fairly safe territory with is thinking about the fact that novel foods will continue to be a major part of our work and will expand, I suspect, actually enormously into all sorts of areas we can't predict. So if you think already, for example, about things that are very live at the moment, so we obviously have our cell cultivated product sandbox, looking at things like lab-grown meat and artificial dairy and so on and so forth. We have done some work, many of you are involved in thinking about the impact of things like 3D printing of foods, which is currently relatively small scale, but in the future might start to kind of open up all sorts of interesting possibilities. And of course, this kind of mainstay of kind of laboratory discovery, and in particular, I think in genetics, where there's a huge amount of interest in things like modified cell lines, precision fermentation, enzyme technology, all sorts of very scientific approaches to making novel foods. So I would say it's a fair bet to say these technologies will only go on to be more and more important over the next 25 years. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I reckon 25 years from now, it will be probably relatively commonplace for people to be eating a genetically genome edited cell cultivated product that is essentially indistinguishable from a traditional product you eat now, and maybe even has been 3D printed in the comfort of your own kitchen on your own little device, a little bit like some of us have bread makers or microwaves or toasters these days. Maybe we'll all have our 3D printing cell cultivated product machine sat on the corner of our desktop, feeding us every day. Let's find out in 25 years time. So food is one, technology is another, I think. And technology obviously has already shaped the food system enormously over not just the last 25 years, but the last hundreds of years, going right back to things like pasteurization of milk, or even the invention of the refrigerator. Going forwards, though, it's really interesting to think about what kind of technology might start to become commonplace that is either non-existent or very niche at the moment. So one that does already exist, but relatively small scale, is vertical farming. And actually, I'm very excited because I'm off to see my first proper vertical farm tomorrow, fingers crossed. So I don't know if it'll look like this, but vertical farming, I think, a lot of interest in. Lots of challenges at the moment, not least around things like energy demands. But as we move forwards with more and more renewable energy, that might become less of a problem. And land, of course, will become more of a problem. So I can easily imagine that things that we currently grow only in fields might start to become quite interesting for vertical farming. So, for instance, at the moment, most vertical farms focus on salad crops, but we might enter a place when they start to focus on things like rice or staples, even like wheat or whatever. And that will be a very interesting kind of development. The technology we use to deliver food and treat food, I think, is quite interesting too. We've already seen over the last few years, of course, massive increase in home deliveries, Uber Eats and Deliveroo and so on and so forth. And now actually several companies starting to develop drone-based delivery systems, especially in China, for food. I think interesting applications there could be really beneficial, certainly for terms of consumer choice, and maybe also in terms of equality, for example. So people who find it difficult to leave their home for whatever reasons, disability, for instance, might suddenly find themselves with access to food that currently is unavailable to them. So I think there's a lot to be celebrated here, but lots of interesting questions about this. So, for example, an automatic drone-based delivery system, who is the operator? Who is responsible? It's clearly not a drone. How do you control that? And what about what happens to that food on the journey? How do you know if the drone hasn't, for example, flown itself through an area where there might be a really abundant amount of allergen that could be causing problems? So above, I don't know, a peanut grinding establishment or something. So lots of interesting challenges around that. And the one I think could be really interesting is the idea of increased use of robotics, not so much in production, which is already of course quite commonplace, but in domestic kitchens. There's lots of interest. This is a prototype robot over in Japan, I think, which is supposed to do some kind of what they call menial kitchen tasks like flipping burgers and toasting bread and this kind of stuff. But the development in robotics is really quite impressive now. So I was recently on a visit up to Edinburgh to the National Robotics Centre and saw one of the robots they're developing together with NASA, which is capable of doing all sorts of things like screwing together joints and putting together simple DIY and all this kind of thing. So I think it's really quite feasible that these will start to enter the kind of retail market fairly soon. And so my second gamble for 25 years is I reckon 25 years from now, a significant proportion of people who have the budget for it will have a robot in their kitchen who is doing quite a lot of the kind of routine kitchen tasks that we currently do, like peeling potatoes or slicing carrots or whatever. And it'll be really interesting to see how that rolls out. And then the other thing which I think is going to change hugely, and we know changes all the time, is us, right? And our behaviors as consumers. If we think about what our parents or our grandparents ate and the way they cooked and shopped, it's completely different, right? So, my grandparents would certainly never have had any thought about the idea of online grocery shopping, for instance. I can very much remember my grandfather having his first pistachio nut and wondering what on earth this thing was. So there's a lot of change that happens without us noticing. And I think it will continue to happen a lot and faster as time goes on. So, for example, one of the things that many of us have already done is start to adapt our behaviors with personalized kind of equipment associated with this. So, for example, a Fitbit. Some people now have things that headbands that will monitor kind of brain activity and sleepiness and this sort of stuff. We're starting to see very small scale, but some people with implantable devices, some obviously for medical purposes like pacemakers. But also, of course, the news stories about Neuralink as a kind of brain-human interface, and actually some people having implanted devices that will monitor for kind of normal purposes rather than for medical purposes, things like blood pressure, free glucose, insulin levels, so on and so forth. I think there'll be more and more of that. And it will start to impact on people's behaviors in terms of food, obviously. So we might end up in a position where people are kind of having their meals not at a sort of standardized meal time, but when their device tells them it's time to eat or not eat, and perhaps even in the future guiding about what it is they need to eat, or maybe even plugging in to restaurants or groceries. So maybe you'll kind of download your data into your supermarket trolley, and it will tell you, oh, you need a bit more protein, but a bit less of this, and your shopping will modify accordingly. Or maybe you won't go to the supermarket at all. In huge numbers of us now do our online shopping for groceries and rarely go into a supermarket. And supermarkets obviously have responded in all sorts of different ways. It's possible that the world of 25 years from now will have no such thing as a kind of retail food thing, and everything will be online deliverable, and there will be no kind of interaction with it. Now, if that happens, what does that mean for individuals' choices, but also for things like control over safety? So now if you go into a shop and pick up a lettuce that looks a bit dodgy, you put it back. But if you have no control over that, you can't see it, and a robot is making that decision, what does that mean for those kind of empowered decisions? Or maybe it's going to go completely the other way around. We already see a lot of people who are very concerned about the level of processing in food. And obviously, those of us involved in things like the ultra processed food debate are often sort of taken to task by people who say, oh, we should all go back to kind of raw ingredient cooking. And there are a lot of benefits, obviously, in fresh fruit and vegetables and increased food preparation at home. So maybe we'll go completely in a different direction. In 25 years from now, people will have abandoned any form of sort of advanced processing for food, and we'll be back to raw materials, making our own meals, and not buying ready meals in any way, shape or form, and maybe even either not eating out at all or eating out much more, where that kind of individual care has been taken over your meals. We'll have to kind of find out which way it goes, I guess. And then the last big change, I think, that is already happening, and I think is going to become even more dramatic, is this idea of food as medicine. So we already know that healthy eating is a kind of mainstay of growing old healthily, right? So fresh fruit and vegetables, reducing saturated fat, sugar, salt, limiting red meat intake, etc., etc. There is really, really strong scientific evidence for the health benefits there. What is now coming, though, is relatively strong evidence for much more subtle effects around things like fermented foods, the presence of short-chain fatty acids in some foods, whole grain fibers, all sorts of different areas where you can tweak your diet to have a positive health impact. Less well established is some of the stuff which is still claimed for. So, for example, you can walk into your local food shop and you can buy all sorts of interesting things with ginger or turmeric or ashwagandha or all sorts of different additives claiming all manner of health benefits. Now, in some cases, that may well be true, but is yet unproven. And in other cases, it may be complete hot air. Either way, though, it has exposed the fact there is a huge market for people looking to buy foods that impact positively on their health. And I think there is likely to be an enormous change in that field as the science starts to catch up. So as we start to learn more and more about exactly which bacteria are beneficial in your gut, which foods stimulate those bacteria, which foods might be naturally antibiotic, which might induce antimicrobial resistance and should be avoided, so on and so forth. And so I think one of the really interesting and, for me at least, exciting but also risky areas is maybe 25 years from now, the main driver of what people eat will not be whether or not you fancy a fillet steak and a couple of scoops of mashed potato, but it will be whether you've had sufficient butyric acid and a couple of whole grain complex carbohydrates that day, and that influences your choice of dinner, in which case the whole landscape of food eating and preparing will change quite dramatically. Who knows? We shall look forward to finding out 25 years from now. As I say, I doubt very much that I will still be here for you to come back and challenge me on it, but maybe we can have a kind of reunion call in 25 years time and see how many, if any, of these things came true. In the meantime, I leave you with the concept of tucking into your mammoth, cell cultivated mammoth burger in 25 years from now with a little bit of probiotic cream on the side. Thank you very much for listening. I'm really looking forward to your Q&A. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Robin, for such a fantastic and thought-provoking presentation there. It's amazing to consider just how quickly some techniques and technologies have progressed in just 25 years. And I really, really enjoyed hearing your thoughts about what might lie ahead. So we can now take any questions. If anyone has anything they'd like to ask, then please continue to add questions using the Q&A box. You'll be able to access that using the button at the top of your screen. And I'll now hand over to Dr. Adam Cook, who will lead us in the Q&A.
So thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Robin, to echo what Rachel said for a really interesting presentation. We're starting to have some questions coming in, and I'm sure there's going to be many more over the next few minutes. But I'm going to start with one of my own. And despite caveating it with a quote from a physicist, you did make some predictions about the future. I particularly like the idea of a robot peeling my potatoes. That would make life a lot easier. What are you most excited about for the future of food science?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Adam. That's, well, quite a lot, I think. I think so. The thing that I'm most excited about is that last one around this idea about food for health benefits. Mostly because I think there's just still so much to discover there, and so much potential for good. It's also probably my biggest worry because people are quite understandably very easily kind of steered by this. If you're so for example, if you're overweight or you're suffering from anxiety and someone says, oh, you can take my magical smoothie and your problems will go away, I can see how that is incredibly appealing, even if there's no sort of scientific evidence behind it. So I think getting that right is perhaps both the biggest risk, but also the most exciting thing. Is if we can get it right, can you imagine the transformative impact if we could even, I don't know, tweak mental health issues, reduce mental health issues by 1% or reduce obesity by 1% simply by encouraging people to do something slightly different rather than telling people, there's this very complicated sort of diet you have to go on, shedding calories, so on and so forth. I think we could have a really, really big impact on people's kind of health and well-being if we can get the science to really prove it underneath.
Thanks for that, Robin. We're not going to be able to get through all the questions, but please keep them coming in. There's one here about how do you see the impact of AI on food safety in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, well, I think probably the big question is there any part of life that is not going to be massively influenced by AI? And I suspect the answer is no. I mean, it will impact hugely on food safety as it does on everything else. I mean, we're already, as you know, thinking about things like the use of AI in sort of initial triage of safety dossiers. Companies are absolutely exploring AI as a way to start preparing documentation for us, handling things like audit reports, etc., etc. So that's already happening. The interesting stuff, I think, is the stuff that we can't really quite envisage at the moment. But for example, I was talking to someone recently who said, well, their company is exploring the idea of AI to train all their new staff. So, for instance, instead of doing your sort of HACCP training and all this kind of stuff, your AI would tell you, and then it would monitor you. So, if you might have CCTVs in your kitchen, and it would monitor you and say, I did tell you about different chopping boards, and you're not doing it, are you? And so I think that kind of integration of AI into our lives is about to come. And it's really, I mean, for those of you who, like me, have teenagers at home, you're probably in the same position where you realize that actually this is suddenly just something that is completely part of their lives in a way that it wasn't even 5 years ago. And so I think it will affect probably everything we do. And the interesting question is how we get that balance right, that we do it kind of make the best of the benefits and minimize the risks.
Yes, no, thanks. And I asked you about what you're excited about, and a question's come up in the chat is, what would be your biggest concern about the future of food? For example, climate change, food poverty, novel foods, or something else?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the most tangible at the moment, I would say it is probably climate change. That's slightly influenced by, I spent yesterday evening at an event at the Royal Society on climate adaptation. I was quite depressed before, and now I'm enormously depressed because, the predictions are really quite grim for all of the world, and which includes lots and lots of developed countries that, I think there's a historical idea that if you're a wealthy country, you might avoid the worst of the effects, but that is not true. We will all get massively impacted. So I think climate change is absolutely going to be a big issue. And, the difficult thing about that is we sort of already know a lot of what we have to do to be prepared for that, but people don't really kind of get it because it feels like a slow burn rail crash or whatever the metaphor is. So I do think that's going to have a huge impact on kind of food security, food availability, and it will hit the poorest in society the hardest. So that's probably my number one concern at the moment, but it might change.
And you talked about predictions, and we talked about them always being a challenge, but how are we doing the horizon scanning at the moment to be set up for future needs?
Yeah, that's obviously a really important part of the kind of CSA function, is to sort of be ready for stuff that's around the corner. So as you know, we have a horizon scanning team within FSA who produce the really excellent insights report every so often that looks specifically at topics that are kind of coming down the line. So that's one. We also have our scientific advisory committees, in particular the Science Council, which spends a lot of its time thinking about stuff that's happening kind of on a big scale 5, 10, 15 years from now. So that might be climate change, that might be technology, so on and so forth. They're about to do a workshop, for example, on artificial intelligence and technology transformation more generally in food safety. And then I think the third part is a lot of these things obviously are not food specific, and so the CSAs from each government department meet every week to do all sorts of things. But one of the things that is kind of part of the brief for that meeting is to kind of share resource around horizon scanning. So quite often, for instance, last year I met with colleagues in the Met Office in DCIT about satellite technology and land mapping, which feels like a long way away from FSA until you think, of course, that actually, you know, mapping your land to satellite tech is what tractors use to plough their crops and sow crops and so on and so forth. So, for instance, a failure in satellite resolution would have an immediate food security impact because farmers would not be able to do their work. And so actually those kind of horizon things that feel a long way away from us, but are going to impact on food, are also part of those weekly discussions.
How do you think weight loss drugs will impact food consumption?
That is a very interesting one. So we were talking about this yesterday. So there was a joint meeting, some of you might have been there, between our social science advisory group, the advisory committee on social science, and DEFRA's equivalent, which I attended for part of the day. It was really nice to see people. And they were thinking largely about the food strategy going forwards. But over lunch, we had a conversation that was exactly around that. And it was very interesting because I think there are sort of two models, right? So in some senses, the kind of bad model is that a sort of drug-based solution to that might mean that people just think, oh well, let's carry on eating lots of Big Macs or whatever, and there are obviously other health impacts rather than just obesity that are negative with some poor diets. So that's kind of one version. There is absolutely, I mean, I just be clear, I think there's absolutely a place for these drugs in health management, and they are transformative for many people. So they are a really great development. The most interesting thing, though, I think, is how it will impact on the wider society. So, for instance, at the moment, most of those drugs significantly reduce appetite, and they also change the type of food you want to eat quite often. So if you're on the drugs, you will absolutely change your diet. But the interesting thing is, it may also well impact on those of us who are not on the drugs, but around people who are. Because if you think about when you go out for dinner, for instance, I don't know about you, but if I'm out for dinner with friends, often there's a question, so as you're settling down for your main course, who's going for dessert? And my decision of whether to go for dessert or not is very strongly influenced by whether the people next to me do or not. Because if everyone says, no, I'm not going for dessert, I'm not going to sit there and tuck into my sticky toffee pudding whilst everyone watches. And so as these kind of behavioural changes trickle through, it'll be very interesting to see whether they have a knock-on impact on people, which may well be beneficial. And maybe that, people like me actually do have less sticky toffee pudding than we should. And that's probably not a bad idea. Or will it actually really change the way people eat in a quite formative way, because they're kind of less worried about the consequences because there is a sort of medicine-based solution? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think whichever it is, I think they will have quite a big impact. As we see now, these are going from very niche drugs to really quite widely used drugs. So it's going to be quite an interesting time to watch that, I think, and perhaps one that we should be thinking about doing a bit of research on going forwards.
And I'm going to slightly adapt a question that's come in, because it's talked about how we're leveraging and collaborating with the big hubs and networks to bring some of the exciting new tech to market, but also how we bring that wider scientific knowledge. So how are we collaborating with large hubs and networks?
Yeah. So quite well. So the short answer is quite intensively, but I think there's always more we can do. And I'm very keen, if people think we're missing a ball on something, I'd be very keen to hear from you. So we have quite good formal links with a lot of the science-based R&D type hubs. So, for example, the Food Safety Network that's run out of Norwich. We have a number of university partnerships. We obviously the PathSafe program, which we've been running within FSA, is a very large collaborative across multiple departments and stakeholders. So we're quite well connected on areas of research. We are very well connected to big business, because obviously that's a huge part of our role, is having clear conversations with retailers, food businesses, production facilities, so on and so forth. I think the place where we could potentially do more is around the slightly niche and unexpected innovation. So, for instance, one that fairly recently we've had a lot of conversations with is around insects for food and feed, which is a small but growing market, and presents some kind of complicated regulatory areas for us. And I think those businesses historically have not interacted that much with us. They have now in the last few years, which is great. But those kind of innovators who may not sort of have thought about kind of reaching out to us, it's a really interesting place to go and talk to. And then the other area I think that it's very difficult to find links with, but it's really important, is stuff that doesn't look like food but might kind of come in that way. So we've already talked a bit about medicines, but also, for example, people developing materials that might then be used in food packaging. They are probably not thinking it that way, but recently I was talking to someone who works on sort of recycled plastics, and they're actually thinking about it for chemical holdings. So they were talking about the huge amounts of plastic waste that come from the NHS, but some of those repurposed materials may well find themselves into food packaging materials. So I think having those conversations with researchers and innovators in areas that don't have food in the title but might well have a food impact is really, really important. And so really the key to that is information. The more we know about those people, the more we can reach out. So yeah, do let us know if you have ideas.
And you mentioned that climate change is a concern for you. What do you think the FSA or individuals should be doing more? Do you think we should be pushing towards a more seasonally grown, locally produced diet? What do you think for either the FSA and or individuals?
Well, that is interesting. So for FSA, so I mean, let's be clear from FSA first. So our first and most important task, as we all know, is food safety and food authenticity. We have our third pillar, so within the strategy, we have this very much recognising our role in sustainability and health, but we are not the regulator for that. So I don't think we can or ever should sort of be telling people, for example, you must not eat this food because it's bad for the environment. We are all about empowering consumers to make choice. I do think we are a trusted voice in the food system. So as, for example, things like eco-labelling start to trickle through, I think there will be an important role for FSA in validating or calling out those kind of systems so that people can make informed choices. So, when you're in the supermarket and you're net zero loaf of bread, you want to know that a regulator like the FSA says, yes, that claim is correct, or if not us, somebody else. So I think there is an important role there in kind of supporting that. But I think it's probably for others to implement the change in the food system, but it's for us to regulate it. For individuals, there is absolutely a huge amount we can do. I think there are two things there. So one is absolutely individual behaviour. That everyone, and I'm exactly the same, sort of thinks, oh, what can I do? I'm just one person. But actually, we are the driver, right? So, reducing fossil fuel use, energy sparing, reducing waste, etc., are all contributions we can make. But the other thing is, I think we are seeing a very, very big upsurge in kind of climate denial, particularly amongst actually senior politicians all around the world, and that is really quite worrying because lots of things are up for debate in science, but this is not one. The case for human-driven climate change is so overwhelming that it is not a scientific controversy, and so I think there is something about politicians and thought leaders respond to what the public thinks. So I think it's really important for people to kind of call that out and say, actually that is not true, and we need to, we need action in this space. And I think, one of the things that really struck me from this conversation we had yesterday was the incredibly hot summer of, what was it, 2022, the one a couple of years ago, we had 40 degrees across much of the UK. So when I looked there, I had a graph on the changing probability of that. So when I was born, 1976, you can work out, I've got a big birthday next year. When I was born, 1976, the probability of a 40-degree day in the UK was less than 0.2%. So the year I was born, it was highly unlikely I would ever see 40 degrees in the UK in my life, because 0.2% means, once every 500 years. Today, that probability is nearer 4%. So it's now highly unlikely that my children will go through their life without seeing at least one, probably several of those days. I think that really hammers it home that we have gone from a situation where this is incredibly unlikely to incredibly likely in one generation. And I think, people need to really think about the speed at which this is changing and do everything they can to kind of, for themselves and to hold others to account to really make those changes.
Okay, so there's been a lot of questions in the chat. A lot of them I think we can reflect on afterwards, and we'll share them with you, Robin, so you can have a look. And I think they'll also be relevant to others in the FSA to see what people are interested in. But I'm going to ask you a penultimate question now, and it goes back to what you were saying about UPFs. So a lot of people say we don't know the effects of UPFs. So what's our approach to regulating them, and what are your thoughts?
Sure. So this is a really tricky topic. So first thing to say, UPS. I mean, there's lots of unknowns in UPS. So the first one is the terminology, right? So ultra processed foods is a term that is useful but not black and white. And so people will be aware of this kind of widely used definition around the fact that they are foods that contain ingredients not in your kitchen cupboard, for instance. So things like E numbers or whatever. But that is not a hard and fast definition. So first of all, there's not a really good definition, but nonetheless, we can kind of agree on some things being ultra processed. Second thing is that even with that definition, it encompasses a huge range of foods there. So a commercial loaf of granary bread may well be an ultra processed food because it might have stabilizers and emulsifiers and stuff in it. But there is overwhelming evidence that eating wholemeal granary bread is good for you. So that's that's one. On the other hand, bright blue bubblegum sweet is also ultra processed, and I would place quite a lot of scientific evidence that there's very little health benefit and probably a lot of health detriment to eating one of those. So it encompasses a very wide area. So what do we do currently? We as you know, we are the authorizer for additives and novel foods. So anything that all those ingredients that are going into ultra processed foods have individually been assessed and as safe by us or by previously EFSA or whoever. So that is not in question. I think what is in question, though, and it's a very valid scientific question, is how does the combination of these ingredients in a food product itself impact on individuals? And that might be different than the individual components, right? So it is possible that if you have 5 different additives combined together in a particular thing, they may be driving detrimental health, maybe either directly on people or possibly indirectly through things like increased appetite, so you overeat or whatever. And we just don't have the science on that. So I think the key thing that we need to do as FSA now is be very, very clear about what we currently do and what we currently don't do, what we don't know. And B, we cannot do this ourselves, but we need to partner wherever possible with others to try and answer some of those outstanding science questions. And so, for example, we've had a lot of very productive conversations last year with colleagues in the United States who are running some of the clinical trials in this area, where they are, for example, comparing in a very, very controlled way ultra processed foods with their less processed equivalents. And I think, one of the big concerns, as you'll be aware, is obviously many of those programs are now at risk because of the very, very severe cuts to the science budget in the US. And so that is a concern for us as an organization. But we will continue to partner wherever we can with people. And I hope that collectively science around the world will eventually come up with answers to these questions. In the meantime, I think the very best health advice we can give to people is that we know overwhelmingly that high fat, sugar, salt, etc., are not great for you. And so if you're looking to make a meaningful improvement in the health of your diet, think about fresh fruit and vegetables and reducing high fat, sugar, salt first. Worry less about UPF for the moment and focus on those ones as your primary goal.
Thanks. So I'm now going to ask you the last question. It's probably my favourite one that's come up so far.
Is there a drum roll? Drum roll, Adam. Drum roll.
You've given us a few predictions. So one of the audience would like to know how can we contact you in 25 years to see whether they were right and to follow up on progress?
Well, I would like to say you can drop me an email, although I suspect by then there won't be an email. I am a recent refugee escaper from what was previously known as Twitter, and I've gone over to Blue Sky, so you can whatever you do on Blue Sky me, but that might not exist in 25 years either. Who knows? Maybe by then we'll have sort of holographic Neuralinks implanted, and you'll be able to just summon me in your thoughts, and I will appear, which is a pretty terrifying thought on which to end, I think. Let's find out. Hope to see you in 25 years.
Thanks very much, Robin, and thanks for answering all those questions, and thanks to the audience for all your questions, and I'll pass back to Rachel.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you, Adam, for facilitating such a stimulating Q&A. And again, thank you everyone for submitting your questions. And of course, a big thanks to Professor May for a fascinating seminar and answering the questions today. We really appreciate you both taking the time to join us. So a recording of today's seminar will be available later via our YouTube channel. You can also catch up on recordings of some of our previous Food for Thought events there. And before we close, if you're not already on the Food for Thought mailing list and you would like to join, then you can sign up via the link that should be shared in the Q&A. Again, if you would like to contact us or if you've got any further questions for Robin, then please do send us an email at foodforthought@food.gov.uk. As mentioned earlier, we always welcome ideas for future speakers. And also, if you're listening and working at the FSA, then we'd love for you to get in touch if you're interested in volunteering with the Food for Thought team. So that just leaves me to say a big thank you to you all for joining us today to reflect on and celebrate 25 years of the FSA. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.